Thanks to EmuDeck, Steam Deck is probably the easiest and best platform you can choose to start your emulation journey. Not only that, but it continues to get updates regularly, and there are a bunch of neat features that I have not really seen covered anywhere. In today's video, I'm going to dig deep into the wonderful world of emulation on Steam Deck. Let's get into it. What's good, Deck Gang? I've been meaning to dive deep into some guides for the Steam Deck, but the news cycle has been busier than expected. Nonetheless, I have an emulation mega guide for you today. Russ from Retro Game Core has already done in-depth coverage of EmuDeck, but now after some months of using it, I wanted to do my own video on the subject, especially given the number of improvements that it's seen over the first few months. Moreover, I know there are a lot of people that are still new to emulation, and Steam Deck is actually a much better starting point than I expected. In fact, I can't think of a better platform to get started with enjoying emulation. For those of us that have been in the scene for a while, it's kind of easy to forget how overwhelming it all is when you're getting started, and one thing I want to stress when you watch this video is to take it slow. I'm going to cover a lot, and there are a million different rabbit holes you can dive into when it comes to emulation, like making your collection look as pretty as possible, or making sure you have all the input stuff configured for every system before ever playing a game. Those rabbit holes can take just as much time as actually playing retro games, which might be okay if that's what you want to do, but mostly I think it's just good to take it slow and enjoy playing the games themselves. I'll be going over some of the advanced topics, but you don't have to do them all. You can just run EmuDeck and start playing games. So bookmark this guide, come back to it. In fact, there are timestamps in the description so you can skip around as needed. On that note, this video took a ton of work, which is why you didn't see any other videos from me recently. So if you like what I'm doing, hit the like, subscribe, and set notifications to all. As an aside, a lot of my motivations are around games preservation, and I don't just mean the more palatable interpretation where we ensure that old games exist somewhere in an ivory tower that only a select few have access to. No, I mean preserving games as a shared experience of the arts for everyone. DMCA seems to agree with me here, as they have long granted an exception to archive.org in order to help archive vintage software. So if you go to archive.org and search for ROMs of vintage games, they are surprisingly easy to find and access. If you want something newer, I would urge you to dump the games yourself. It's not as easy as some make it out to be, but it's safer for you, and these games are still available for purchase at a reasonable price, so why not purchase them? With that, let's kick things off with the one thing that makes the Steam Deck the best platform for getting started with emulation. EmuDeck. EmuDeck is easy enough that half of you watching won't need any instructions, but for the rest of you, here goes. EmuDeck is not quite an application, it's actually a collection of scripts that will install and configure emulators for you on your Steam Deck. This is extremely nice and eliminates some of the biggest barriers to getting started. Shout out to Dragon Dough Rise for putting this together, also shout out to Godsbane and 15 other contributors to this project, as well as I guess many in the Linux and emulation community for making this possible in the first place. Let me also plug the EmuDeck Discord. It was one of the most helpful Discord servers I've ever been in. No question was too dumb, and quick searches often revealed some of the same problems I was having and even pointed to a relevant GitHub issue if you wanted to monitor progress. With that out of the way, let's get started. Just go to emudeck.com and click the installation guide. The instructions here are very straightforward. First, you'll want one SD card for all of your games and any other needed files like BIOS files. Format your microSD card inside of the Steam Deck's gaming mode. Make sure to not miss this step if you're going to put your games on the SD card. Next, go to the desktop on the Steam Deck, go to emudeck.com in a browser and click download. Click the download app button. You'll only ever need to download this once because it will subsequently download updated scripts from the internet as needed. So move this file over to the desktop. It may not run the first time you click, and you will need to make it an executable. Right-click the icon, go to the Permissions tab, and tick the Is Executable box. You may also see a warning when you try to run it. Just click Continue. Now it's going to ask you a couple quick questions and run some installation scripts based on your answers. I think now is a good time to say that this process is completely repeatable, so don't worry too much about making a mistake. You can just start over and repeat the process from the beginning. Alright, so the first question asks if you want to do easy or expert mode. Of course, if this is your first time, go ahead and select easy, but don't be afraid to come back here later and see what kind of extra options you'll have access to. It's pretty neat. Okay, the next question is about where you want to install your games. Do Do you want to install it on the Steam Deck hard drive or an SD card? An SD card is a really nice option here, so I would recommend that. This is going to create some folders for you either in your SD card or on your home directory, so either way the data won't get wiped the next time you update SteamOS. The last thing EmuDeck will tell you to do is to move your games and launch Steam ROM Manager. Go ahead and launch it. I'll pause here to talk about what EmuDeck has done so far. So far, EmuDeck has installed and configured 11 emulators: Yuzu for Switch, Citra for 3DS, Cemu for Wii U, Dolphin for Wii and GameCube, RPCS3 for PS3, PCSX2 for PS2, DuckStation for PS1, PPSSPP for PSP, Xemu for OG Xbox, and finally Retroarch for everything else. It also installs PrimeHack, which is a version of Dolphin specifically made to play Metroid Prime with traditional first-person shooter controls. Where possible, it downloaded the Flatpak version of these applications. Cemu is a notable exception since it is a Windows-only app. This may change in the future as the landscape evolves, but I think it's helpful to know what's happening. To that end, you can keep most of the emulators up to date by updating apps in the Discover store, but for Cemu, the easiest way to update it is to rerun EmuDeck. The next thing EmuDeck does is create a folder structure wherever you decided you wanted to store your games. If you chose the SD card, you'll see a new folder called Emulation. Inside that directory are 4 more directories: ROMs, Tools, BIOS, and Saves. The ROMs folder is where you're going to put your games. There are over 40 folders in here for different platforms. You can refer to the EmuDeck README for what sort of file formats are allowed. The BIOS folder is for BIOS files. These are files that are required for some platform emulators to run. I can't redistribute these, but you can search for BIOS packs if needed. And finally, the Saves folder is for all your game saves. This would be a good directory to sync or back up if you have multiple emulation machines. At this point, you'll want to move your games over if you haven't already. If you're moving files from Windows to your newly formatted SD card, you have approximately 1 infinity options for doing that. For example, you can load files on the thumb drive and plug your thumb drive and SD card into the Steam Deck at the same time and transfer files from there. Personally, I have a file share that I access through my local network. I copy files from my share to these folders that were created by EmuDeck. Finally, there are 2 apps that EmuDeck has installed to manage your game collection. These are Steam ROM Manager and EmulationStation. Steam ROM Manager is going to add individual games to Steam. This is especially good for smaller collections. If you have a larger collection and you don't want every single one of your games on Steam, then EmulationStation is an excellent alternative that I'll talk more about in a bit. Okay, so back to Steam ROM Manager. As I said, this is going to add individual games to Steam with box art, and it's going to create a Steam collection per platform. If you've never used this before, it can be pretty intimidating to look at, but EmuDeck has already done a lot of the work for you, and there's only a few things you need to know. First, on the left-hand side are a list of platforms that you can enable and disable. Each item on this list is called a parser. These parsers are going to scrape a given folder and look for valid games for that platform. Now, if you want to add every game to Steam, just keep everything enabled. If you want to disable a certain platform, just search for it here and toggle it off. You may need to expand the left navigation. When you're ready, go to the preview section at the top, then click Generate App List at the bottom. This is going to populate the list of games that Steam ROM Manager found, each with grid images for those games. Note that it can take some time for all the images to load if you have a large collection. You can click the left or right arrows for alternative box art, or you can provide your own by clicking the upload button on the bottom left. You'll also want to look at not just the grid art, but the poster art, since most of the time this is the art that you'll see on the Steam Deck. This is one of those rabbit holes that I was talking about. In the past, I've been prone to making sure every game has a nice looking box art selected. In any case, when you're ready to save your changes, you'll want to make sure that Steam is not running, so go ahead and exit out of Steam now. Finally, click Save App List. At this point, you can reopen Steam to see if your games have been added. You should not only have all those games added, but there should be collections for each platform. It looks really nice. By the way, the parser that is listed second from the top in the Steam ROM Manager, that's to add individual emulators to Steam. It's off by default, but it is helpful. I chose to enable it because I found it useful to have the emulators handy so that I can tinker with settings without having to exit back to the desktop. And the parser all the way at the top is for EmulationStation. If you keep that parser enabled, you'll be able to launch EmulationStation from Steam. Let's talk a little bit about that. EmulationStation is a really robust front end that allows you to easily navigate a large game collection. This is another one of those rabbit holes that you can lose yourself in when it comes to retro gaming. I mean, there are all sorts of enhancements, not to mention how it encourages you to groom your collection. You can download themes for EmulationStation for different looks and feel. You can also download all sorts of media and metadata for your games, including box art, screenshots, and short video. You can even rate games and set favorites to further organize your collection. So when you first start EmulationStation, you'll be able to navigate through your platforms, and when you select the platform, you'll see a list of games you can scroll through and select. If this looks kind of bare, it's because you haven't downloaded any of the media. So press the start button and you'll be presented with a menu. The first menu item is Scraper, and this is where you can download media for your games. You can choose which games or which systems to scrape for. You can also choose what type of content to download. For example, video for each game can add up pretty quickly, and some people may decide that they don't want to download that. So you can go to content settings and be specific about what type of media you want to download. And when you're ready, just hit start. Again, depending on the size of your collection, this can take quite a bit of time. When it's done, it should look like this. Again, this is really nice to look at, and I can see why people can get lost here. When it comes to launching a game from here, most everything should just work. And because it opens a game in another window, you can open the Steam menu and choose to close the specific window when you're done. So that's Steam ROM Manager and EmulationStation, and overall they're both very helpful and fairly straightforward. I think 90% of people will have everything they need to proceed, but I did extensive testing on each emulator to talk about some of the features that EmuDeck has configured for you and to address some of the common problems. Let's start with Yuzu. I've covered Yuzu before, but there are some common issues that pop up, as well as some tips for improving performance. One common issue I've seen with Yuzu is sometimes it won't open a folder in places where it should. For example, if you click File, Open Yuzu Folder, this should open the Yuzu folder, which doesn't always work. Another example is when you right-click a game and go to Open Mod Data Location. So instead, it's helpful to know how to get to these locations yourself. I'll paste the paths in the description below. With regard to mods, they are both extremely helpful and extremely easy to install in Yuzu. For example, with Link's Awakening, the 60 FPS mod and the mod that removes tilt shift are needed for solid performance. So just go to the Switch Mods page on the Yuzu site, look for the mods in question, and download them. Then unzip those files and put the folders in the mod data folder. Now, when you launch Yuzu and right-click the title, you should see those mods enabled by default. While you're here, disable the update if you have it and set the resolution to 0.75x. Now you should have near 60 FPS the entire time. Note that sometimes there are 16:10 aspect ratio mods for some games. That's something else that's worth trying on the Steam Deck, which does have a 16:10 screen. Another cool note here is that EmuDeck has configured some hotkeys for Yuzu. So if you press Select and A at the same time, that will pause or unpause emulation. If you hold Select and R2, that will fast forward, which is helpful for text-heavy RPGs. And finally, Select plus Start will exit the game, which is actually the only clean way that I experienced to exit out of Yuzu. By the way, as of writing, EmuDeck is using the Flatpak version of Yuzu, but they will be switching to the app image version very soon, which is more up to date and should therefore have generally better performance or compatibility on newer games. On the subject of performance, I usually keep the GPU option in Yuzu to normal. I use the Vulkan backend, and I'll try sub-native resolutions to see if that helps. You can also try limiting the GPU clock in the quick access menu to hopefully allow more cycles to go to the CPU. You can also use the unofficial plugin manager and the Power Tools plugin to park some cores. Going down to 4 cores will improve the clock speed of those cores that are still active, which will typically increase performance. Even with all that, there are still a number of games that don't run full speed, but it's good enough for me. Next up is Citra, the emulator for the Nintendo 3DS. This works really well, and the touchpad controls out of the box are even better than I expected. When you launch a new game for the first time, I would suggest changing the controller layout to the EmuDeck Citra 3DS template that EmuDeck imported into your Steam profile. It should be easy to find. Just hit the Steam button, go to controller settings, select the template, and Citra 3DS should be near the top. Now you have a few hotkeys: L4 for full screen, R4 to swap screens, L5 to try different layouts, and R5 to exit the emulator. I find it best to keep the default screen layout, which is one big screen and one small screen, and then you can use R4 to swap between the screens as needed. I was able to play Picross really well with this setup, but I suppose the real test is Kid Icarus Uprising. Okay, yeah, this is significantly harder, and it can be made a bit easier by using touchscreen to aim, but I think this is a good time to try mouse region instead. Mouse region is a type of input in Steam Input that will snap the trackpad aiming to a specified region on the screen. So all of my touchpad input will go to the small region here. Now aiming is a lot more intuitive. I've saved this as a community layout called EmuDeck Citra Kid Icarus with mouse region, and I was able to do this thanks to a previous layout from a YouTuber named Torankusu. In any case, performance is still not great for this game, but I haven't spent any time trying to optimize it. I spent all my time trying to optimize the controls instead. Pretty cool what can be done with some elbow grease. Finally, now we can play Breath of the Wild on the go. Seriously though, if you're looking to play Breath of the Wild, you should consider using the Wii U emulator Cemu. If you only have the Switch version, then go ahead and use Yuzu, but the Wii U version does run better on the Steam Deck, so here are some brief notes on using Cemu. First of all, this is not a flat pack, so you'll have to run EmuDeck to get the latest version whenever you want to update this emulator. By the way, despite being a Windows app, you do not need to set the Steam Play option to use Proton. EmuDeck has now configured that for you. Some games like Breath of the Wild require not just the game data, but an update for the game as well. You can just run the update with Cemu open by clicking File, Install Game or Update, and finding the appropriate meta.xml file. Feel free to ignore the keyboard error if you see it. You can also place these update files manually using the instructions provided in the EmuDeck wiki. Now that that's done, let's run some Zelda. When you first fire it up, it will run at 20 FPS. You're going to need some mods. Right-click the game in Cemu and click Edit Graphics Pack. Then press Download the latest community graphics packs in the bottom right. From here, you want to tick two boxes in particular. First is the graphics box because you can change the aspect ratio to 16:10 here. Then under Mods, select FPS++. Here, I selected the 60 FPS limit, but technically you can go to advanced settings to try a 40 FPS option. I didn't test this, but it's probably worth a try. With these settings, Breath of the Wild will run a lot smoother than before, hovering now around 40 most of the time. I did lock the refresh rate to 40, and it ran very well under those settings. I bet you could even get the game to look even a little better than this by going back to the mods and playing around with what's there. But for me, this is good enough. Don't forget to choose the EmuDeck Cemu controller layout. This will give you the option to cleanly exit by using Select plus Start, and it will allow you to check the second Wii U screen by holding R4 or R5. One more item to look into is Steam Deck Gyro DSU. This is a tool that you can use for either Yuzu or Switch, and it will pass the Steam Deck Gyro input back to the emulator. Notably, EmuDeck can install this for you. Just run EmuDeck in expert mode and make sure to enable the Steam Deck Gyro DSU option. Finally, this game did lock up for me when I resumed from sleep. I didn't see this reported anywhere, so that may just be me. Next up, let's use Dolphin to play some Wii games. There's not a lot to say here. Dolphin mostly just works, and Wii games already run widescreen, so games look good here. The one thing I will point out here in particular is that EmuDeck has created a few input profiles for Wii games, and they're quite useful. The default input uses the right analog for pointer controls, but there's another profile that allows trackpad for the pointer. This is of course great for Mario Galaxy. The trouble is setting up controls per game. It's slightly less intuitive than Yuzu, but it's pretty easy once you know what you're doing. Open up Dolphin and right-click the game you want to edit, in this case Mario Galaxy, go to Properties and then Editor. In the bottom panel, I can specify special INI variables. There's a wiki where you can look all of these variables up. I'm creating a header for controls, and I'm going to set the Wiimote Profile 1 variable equal to Wii Galaxy. Now I'll fire this game up, set the touchpad to mouse, and I'm good to go. The touchpad now controls the pointer. Of course, Dolphin is also the emulator for GameCube. Most GameCube games perform quite well at 2x resolution on the Steam Deck, which EmuDeck has set as a default. You may run into some games that are more demanding. F-Zero GX is a good example, but it turns out that this runs nearly full speed once I enable the skip EFB access from CPU hack. Even the notoriously demanding Sand Ocean track stays near 60 the entire time. That's huge. Just as with Mario Galaxy, I'm going to set up a per game profile for F-Zero GX. Open Dolphin, right-click the game, go to Properties, and enter this in the Editor panel. A header called Video Hacks, and a variable called EFB Access Enable set to false. That does the trick. Similarly, if you need to disable the widescreen hack, for example with Rogue Leader, you would enter the following in the same box. And the last thing to cover with Dolphin are the hotkeys. All of the hotkeys are driven by the select button. If you just hold select by itself, it will fast forward. If you hold select and press R1, it will do a quick save state. Then select plus L1 to quick load that same state. Select and A will pause and unpause emulation, and finally select and start is going to exit the app. As far as I'm concerned, PrimeHack is the definitive way to play the Metroid Prime Trilogy. If you don't know by now, PrimeHack is a version of Dolphin, the GameCube and Wii emulator, and it's designed to play the Metroid Prime games with traditional first-person controls. This of course means that you can use touchpad and gyro to aim like any other shooter. Technically, PrimeHack is compatible with almost any of the GameCube or Wii versions of the games, but I opted for the Trilogy on Wii. I can't say I tested these extensively, but I did test a bit and it felt great. Moreover, I did my research and it seems like 1 and 2 can be completed at full speed with those controls, no problem. There is a section in Metroid Prime 3 that still requires the system's gyro, so you can't pass that by default. The devs are working on this, however, and hopefully it will be available soon. All of the Dolphin hotkeys apply except for fast forward. By default, this was not set to select, and I didn't really investigate further. Outside of that, happy bounty hunting. Alright, let's get to some PS3. Everyone wants to know about Persona 5, which we will get to, but how about Super Stardust HD and Tokyo Jungle on the Steam Deck? Bruh! Anyway, so PS3 is not only one of the most demanding platforms for the Steam Deck, but it also took a little more work for me than the other platforms. First of all, I had a problem opening folders from within the app, which is similar to a problem I was having with Yuzu. For example, you have to install a PS3 firmware when you first start RPCS3, and you can do so by clicking File, Install Firmware. Typically, this would pop up a window to select the firmware file, but it wasn't working for me in RPCS3. This also happened when installing packages, which you need to do for PSN-style games. Thankfully, you can drag and drop these and it should work about as well. So then, as I said, the first thing you need to do is install some PS3 firmware. You can literally just get a firmware file from the Sony website. Then there are 2 types of games you can play, and these are both a little confusing to set up the first time you do it. First are the PSN style games. These are .pkg files that contain the payload and .rap files that are effectively the license for the package. You have to install these for them to show up in the Steam ROM Manager. Then there are the disk-based games. Steam ROM Manager looks for a specific file in a specific location to import a game. That is /roms/ps3 /game title /ps3 game /userdir /eboot.bin. If this file is not in basically this exact location, then Steam ROM Manager will not find it unless you modify the parser yourself. So those are the 2 ways to make sure games get imported into Steam. Getting them to show up in EmulationStation is a whole other matter, and I'm going to skip that for today's video. Before we continue, there is one more really serious flaw with playing RPCS3 on the Steam Deck, and it's that suspend and resume does not work. If you put your Steam Deck to sleep and then turn it back on, the game is going to typically be stuck. The RPCS3 devs are working on this, and as of writing, there is an update which appears to fix some games for some people, but it still wasn't working for me. So with all that out of the way, let's talk about the best settings for running PS3 games like Persona 5. Thankfully, Reddit user KORace has put together some excellent tips, so let's go through that. They recommend manually setting the GPU clock to 600, and then as far as emulator settings go for this game, they say enable SPU loop detection, set the SPU block size to mega, SPU threads to 2, maximum spurs threads to 4, and then you actually want to make sure audio buffering is off despite the audio stuttering issues. Using these settings was definitely the best performance I was able to get with Persona 5, and it managed to stay around 30 FPS in the opening scenes. Of course, it is still very taxing on the Steam Deck, and the fan was going over 6,000 RPM even during cutscenes. Not to mention the frame timing was kind of all over the place. Still, if you want portable Persona 5, this is your best option, for now. PS2 emulation started out rough on the Steam Deck, but has quickly gotten a lot better. Notably, they recently added a Vulkan backend, which really helps with Linux support. There are also huge updates to the UI that are only available in Windows, but should be coming to Linux eventually, so keep a lookout for those. So in order to get PlayStation 2 games running, you'll need to make sure the appropriate BIOS files are in the BIOS folder. You're looking for files that look like this. Aside from that, PS2 emulation is very straightforward. While Steam Deck is powerful enough to handle PS2 emulation pretty handily, the Vulkan renderer is still not particularly mature, so you will see dips in demanding games. God of War 2 runs in the mid to high 50s, for example. I'd still qualify this as extremely playable, but it may not run as ideal as you want just yet. If you pick the appropriate controller layout, you should have the following hotkeys: select plus R4 to fast forward, select plus R1 to save state, select plus L1 to load, and finally select plus start to exit the application. By default, EmuDeck selects DuckStation for PS1 emulation. Just as with PS2, you'll need the appropriate BIOS files. Outside of that, PS1 runs great as you'd expect. You can choose the DuckStation controller layout, which gives you access to a touch menu. You should note that you'll have to hold many of the selections in the touch menu. That's done so you don't accidentally load a state and lose hours of progress. When it comes to multi-disc games, you can make a custom M3U file in the text editor to make a playlist out of all the discs. Steam ROM Manager will recognize the M3U file and import that. However, it will also import anything else that matches the parser, so you may end up with duplicates. You can manually remove those. You can also mess around with the parser and clean up your files if you're feeling froggy, but that's definitely a little more work up front. Like PS1, PSP emulation is pretty straightforward. The emulator doesn't allow button combos for hotkeys, so EmuDeck has configured R2 to quick save and L2 to quick load. Performance is solid, and I didn't encounter any significant issues even when playing demanding games like God of War. Next up is Xemu, the Xbox emulator. I'm really glad this works as I've waited a long time to play the black version of Ninja Gaiden on the go. Not to mention Jet Set Radio Future and some other gems that are still only on the OG Xbox. Once again, you're going to need some BIOS files that go in the BIOS folder, as well as a dummy hard drive file that goes in the saves folder. The latter can actually be found on the Xemu site, but you'll still have to find the BIOS files on your own. I really only played Ninja Gaiden and there were some dips, but they mostly seemed associated with shader compilation. I'll have to see if there's a shader cache that I can download for this. Still, I don't necessarily expect full speed, but a consistent high 50s would be perfect for me. And finally, we come to Retroarch, the multi-platform front-end for emulators and more. You can use this for basically any home console or handheld prior to the PS2 and even the Dreamcast. Not to mention emulators for early personal computer platforms like Amiga and Commodore. There are also cores for game engines like the OpenLARA engine for early Tomb Raider games. What's more is EmuDeck has pre-configured a bunch of awesome stuff. For games that don't run in widescreen, it has pre-configured bezels. It also configured filters like this one on the GBA, which gives you that clean pixel, almost dot matrix sort of look. And of course the hotkeys, R3 and L3 brings up the really robust Retroarch menu where you can change like any of these configurations. There's also the usual select plus start to exit the application, select an A to pause or unpause emulation, and you can fast forward with select an R2. Finally, load and save state with select plus L1 and select plus R1 respectively. And if you run EmuDeck via expert mode, it can configure retro achievements for you too. Retro achievements is really cool and I highly recommend it as a way to play through your retro backlog. It basically injects achievements into games that never had any. You just need an account on the site to get started. So overall, EmuDeck is really awesome. As you can see, the maintainer has put a lot of work into a consistent design language throughout, even if most of it is invisible. There are the hotkeys that are inspired by Emulate, so usually it's the right shoulder button or trigger to quick save and a left shoulder button to quick load. Things like that. Also, easy mode is designed to be extremely user-friendly with minimal input needed from you. Anything that requires keyboard input, for example, has to be selected from expert mode. In general, performance tuning is going to be pretty similar across the board. The general rules of thumb are to make sure you're using a Vulkan renderer and to increase CPU clock speeds, usually by manually throttling the GPU clock speeds. You can also try downloading shader caches so that these are not being compiled on the fly and causing stutters. With regard to input, trackpads and gyro make virtually any input method replicable to some degree, and Steam input more generally will make it so that you can have per game controller layouts no problem. And that's not all. Emulation on Steam Deck has matured a lot in just a few short months, and there are already a lot more prospects on the horizon. If you take a peek at the EmuDeck beta on Discord, you'll have access to the Switch app image as opposed to the Flatpak. This improves compatibility for recent games like Kirby. There's also the ability to enable Xbox 360 emulation in expert mode. 360 emulation on Linux is still rough, but it's coming along nonetheless. Then there are emulator updates. Cemu devs have said that they're working on a proper Linux version. PCSX2 has a big UI update that's not available in Linux yet, and Vita emulation is reportedly pretty good on the Steam Deck, so maybe we'll see that in EmuDeck soon. I'm going to start folding these updates into my regular news videos and maybe do a yearly review of the state of emulation on deck. I also plan on covering an alternative to EmuDeck called RetroDeck, so stay tuned. Speaking of which, this video took a lot of work and I'm really proud of it. I don't really offer any good incentives to join my Patreon because I want everyone to have access to everything, but if you want to help support this channel, consider joining my friends there. You don't have to do a subscription, you can do a one-time pledge. In any case, Deck Gang out. Goodbye!